After another secret Christmas vacation with Nancy and her children in Austria and Hungary, marriage was now on the cards. But Dirac could not bring himself to commit. No one knew of his inner turmoil. All they saw was the familiar, meditative Dirac, the prince of asceticism, going wordlessly about his business. But in private he was not quite as cold and detached as he seemed to be. On his mantelpiece he kept a photograph of Nancy in a swimsuit, but no one saw it. When there was a knock on the door of his college rooms, he took the photograph down and hid it in a drawer. When many of his associates thought he was working, he was sloping off to see Mickey Mouse films, taking the Kapitza boys out for runs in his new car, and reading T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom. In a bid to make Dirac more self-aware, Nancy recommended that he read Aldous Huxley's Point Counterpoint, as she thought Dirac resembled the novel's character, Philip Quarles, brilliant, solitary, emotionally a foreigner, and entrenched in that calm, remote, frigid silence. Not seeing the likeness, he wrote to Nancy, "I doubt very much whether I am really like Philip Quarles, because his parents are not like mine," underlining, of course, perhaps unconsciously, the importance that Dirac's mother and father played to his sense of identity. Dirac wrote his letters to Nancy before he went to bed. "It's the best time for thinking about you." He never mentioned his work, nor did she inquire about it, and he rarely referred to his colleagues. But he did make an exception in February, shortly before he was due to meet Bohr and his wife in London. It was not long before Nancy, tired of the praise Dirac heaped on his elderly friend in one letter after another. "Bohr, Bohr, Bohr," she yawned. Dirac was surprisingly sensitive to these complaints, and showed that he appreciated that her hair-trigger jealousy needed to be handled with care by toning down the complimentary references to colleagues that he admired. His tact was again tested shortly before the Easter vacation, when Nancy was hoping to see him. He explained to her that he felt duty-bound to visit his parents, as he had not seen them for several months. The problem was that after his short visit to Bristol, he would be in no fit psychologically to meet with her. "It really will change me when I go home. It will make me afraid to do anything for my own pleasure. I shall probably be afraid to think of you. I find it satisfies me to be able to think of you whenever I wish. Why cannot you be satisfied in the same way? You should cultivate your imagination. It would be no use for me to see you for 1 or 2 days, because, as you know, I am never kind to you the first day or 2 whenever I meet you." Dirac pleaded with her to understand the paralysis that overcame him whenever he set foot in 6 Julius Road. "But if you cannot imagine this, you will never understand me," he wrote. But Nancy showed no sympathy. He was selfish, she told him. She had no interest in cultivating her imagination. She was not asking the earth. All she wanted was to see her man in the flesh. You do not consider anything but from your point of view, she wrote. We are very different in the fact that you never think to help people or to make them happy, in spite of the fact that you are in the lucky situation where it would be easy to do so. I like you less. Anyway, she got her way. Shortly before Easter, Dirac returned to Bristol for a few days, and having taken a few days to recover, organised a vacation with Mansi in Budapest. I cannot imagine being happier than I was with you, she wrote to him. Finding it hard to express his joy, he assured her that the vacation left him not wanting feminine society at all. After Easter, Dirac's colleagues in St. John's were surprised to see him so sunburnt, and when they asked him where he had been, he replied, Yugoslavia. The first casualty of Dirac's secret love was his commitment to the literal truth. During the first week of June 1936, Dirac was gathering together his rucksack, sleeping bag, ice axe, rope, and crampons, preparing for his next climbing vacation in the USSR with Tam. Besides visiting Kapitsa, he wanted to be in the Caucasus on the 19th of June to see a solar eclipse, the first he will have seen. Before leaving, he wrote to Mansi, asking her not to write to him, because if Tam and Kapitsa notice that you and I write very much to each other, then very quickly the news would be spread to physicists all over the world, and they would all gossip about us. Kapitsa was in better spirits, reading his subscription copies to the New Statesman and supervising the building of his new institute. Many of its rooms were replicas of the ones of the Monde laboratory, though Kapitsa ensured that his new director's office was even grander, with an even larger footprint. And, after he demanded that every item of his laboratory equipment should be transferred, Rutherford complained that it seemed Kapitsa would not be happy until the paint of the Monde laboratory had been scraped off the walls. The Soviet Union was still the talk of the Cambridge Common Rooms, and the Cambridge Review abounded with articles about it, including a sceptical review of Crowther's Soviet Science, a whitewash that declared the Stalinist state's interference in science was minimal. The Trinity College scholar Anthony Blunt, later a distinguished art historian, wrote an article about how a gentleman traveller might make the best of Russian hospitality, the champagne and caviar, if not the bedbugs. Unknown to his colleagues, Blunt had recently become a Soviet spy. Shortly before Dirac set off for Russia, he heard from his mother that his father was severely ill with pleurisy. Every breath was painful and liable to be accompanied by a stabbing pain in his midriff. Flo wrote that the family doctor had ordered her husband to stay in bed for 10 days, but assured her that, I'm not to worry, as Pa is the kind of man to make things the worse of anything just to keep me busy. From the tone of his mother's letter, Dirac sensed that his father was not seriously ill, and he knew that his parents were supported by Betty, about to move permanently to London to become a secretary. So he decided to set off on vacation and arrived in Moscow on Saturday, but within hours received a telegram from his mother telling him that his father was dying. He decided to head home, perhaps hoping to make one last effort to make his peace with his father, to achieve a reconciliation that had not been possible with his brother Felix. Having left his hiking gear with Tam, he caught the 7 a.m. flight from Moscow. He had 22 hours to find the right parting words. Charles grumbled that he did not want to be confined to bed at home because his wife was not taking proper care of him, so his doctor arranged for a professional nurse to take up residence in 6 Julius Road at night and to supervise Charles's care during the day. But that was not enough. After a few days, he demanded to be moved to a nursing home on the perimeter of the nearby St. Andrew's Park, where he chose a comfortable room whose bay windows looked out onto the beds of early summer flowers. The staff soon realized that they had an awkward customer on their hands. The matron told Flo that Charles was an awful fidget, so restless and fussy, and that the nurses were instructed to leave him alone and look into his room every half an hour. Struggling against pleurisy and the onset of pneumonia, he suddenly decided that he wanted to go home, but his doctor forbade it. Flo stopped visiting him, leaving him alone with his stabbing chest pains, his quarrels with the nurses, and his reflections on the past 69 years. One of his bitterest regrets must surely have been his estrangement from his son. Einstein II, as the Daily Mirror had described him 3 months before. This adulatory article, which Charles is almost certain to have read, concluded by telling its readers that their great-grandchildren might one day talk about him, having forgotten Noel Coward, Henry Ford, and Charlie Chaplin. One sentence in the piece will have taken Charles by surprise. The anonymous author wrote that Paul Dirac is only happy when he is in the lecture room, at the wheel of his sports car, and in his home in Bristol, where he can talk with his father. At the end, the only member of Charles Dirac's family to be standing by him was his daughter, and she was about to break his heart by moving to London. On the day she was due to start work, Monday the 15th of June, he died, and the end came a few hours short before his son arrived in Bristol, any hope of a deathbed reconciliation having been extinguished. 2 days earlier, on a warm and cloudy summer afternoon, 2 days later, on a warm and cloudy summer afternoon, Dirac was among the mourners at the funeral. It was a civic occasion, held in St. Bonaventure's, the handsome Catholic church at the end of Egerton Road, near the family home. A few hours before, at 8 in the morning, the choir had sung a requiem mass over Charles's open coffin near the altar. The funeral was scheduled to begin at 3 p.m. Shortly before, dozens of mourners had made their way through the Bishopston streets. Representatives from the Esperanto Society, the Merchant Venturers Technical College, the French Circle, the Cotham Road School, including several schoolchildren. There was also an elderly Arthur Pickering, the man who had introduced Dirac to Riemannian geometry, still telling stories how he had struggled to find challenges for the most precocious student he had ever had. The eulogy, the weeping, the sacred music, the lowering of Charles's coffin into the grave, together they may have stirred Dirac to reflect on the good things his father had done for him. Charles had ensured that his younger son had had an excellent education, and had encouraged him to study mathematics. It was Charles who had given him the money he desperately needed in order to begin his studies in Cambridge. Straight after the funeral, Dirac gave vent to his feelings in a single-page letter to Mansi. In the most expansive handwriting he ever used in his life, he wrote that he would return to Moscow after he had spent a week with his mother. I think that in Russia I can best get to grips with my new situation. He wanted to see Mansi again, he told her, but gave her firm instructions not to contact him. I would rather you did not wire me while I am in Bristol, because my mother would probably open it. Dirac concluded with some simple words of relief. I feel much more free now. I feel I am my own master. Charles Dirac had left no will. He probably did not want to leave much to his wife, and probably could not face the thought that his true wishes would have been known to all the people who revered him as a family man. Flo had long suspected that he had been squirreling his money away, but even she was stunned by the amount he had hoarded. The net value of his estate was £7,590, 9 shillings and sixpence, almost 15 times his annual salary. Half of the legacy was shared by Paul and Betty, and the rest went to Flo, who quickly headed off to a restorative holiday in the Channel Islands, where she wrote to her son, "I've won my liberty, and I shall keep it." Betty, apparently finding her mother's relief unseemly, departed for London, and never lived in Bristol again, but occasionally corresponded with her mother. Betty was piqued when she read that Flo had destroyed most of her father's papers in a bonfire in the back garden. The remainder of the papers she gave to Paul. From them we know that, somehow, several of his parents' love letters survived. When Flo returned to Bristol, she arranged for Charles's gravestone in Canford Cemetery to be engraved with the words Paul had written for her. In loving memory of our dear son, Reginald Charles Felix Dirac, BSc, Easter Sunday 1900, March the 5th, 1925, and of my dear husband, Charles Adrien Ladislas Dirac, Bachelor ès Institut, father of the above, July 31st, 1866, June the 15th, 1936. Dirac was obviously determined that the tone of family memories of his father's should owe more to propriety than honesty. His mother wrote to him, "One doesn't mind," after a few months. When Dirac resumed his visit to Russia, he celebrated by attempting to climb Mount Elbrus, 5,600 meters above sea level, the highest peak in the Caucasus, a near wilderness. With Tam and a small party of his Russian colleagues, Dirac hiked through the forest to reach a base camp, and then scaled the eastern side of the mountain, fearful of injury, sweat dribbling down his back, and sunburning his face in the day, shivering in the tent at night. Mount Elbrus yielded its rewards only grudgingly, as hundreds of defeated mountaineers had found, some as they fell to their deaths. After several days, Dirac and his fellow climbers saw Russia's most majestic glacial scenery, sights of all the sweeter for the pain that must have been suffered to win them. He only just made it. After reaching the top, he was spent, and had to rest for a day before he could begin the journey back to base. Never again would he attempt such an ambitious climb. After recuperating, Dirac joined Kibitsa, who was back in his buoyant back to his buoyant best. The building of the Institute was progressing well, and the first consignments of his equipment were about to arrive from the Cavendish. The authorities were taking care of him. Although most Soviets suffered food shortages, Rutherford heard from Kapitsa that he was eating oysters, caviar, and smoked sturgeon of a quality that would make even the Trinity College gourmands at high table dribble. In under 3 years, the Soviet authorities had won him round.